Lead balloons.
It's the alchemy of
Unpopular opinions. So,
Whoops, I have somewhere to be. There's actually bourbon in this, so everyone knows.
those things are very complicated and
I don't know that I actually believe what I'm about to say.
spreading lies.
This critical culture that we live in.
Just to try to be an asshole.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to our podcast, Lead Balloons, the alchemy of unpopular opinions. My name's Joel here in Dallas. I'm with my hat-loving friend, T-Dog Hunter. How you doing, Trent?
Couldn't be better. Not too much to complain about. Some, but not a lot.
We'll just skate over those some things to complain about and stay positive here.
All right.
We're going to continue a theme here that we kind of picked up last week on our previous podcast. I'm not sure what order you're listening to things, but on this previous episode, we dove into parables of Jesus in the New Testament. Since we both have master's degrees in biblical studies, we discussed our various approaches to interpretation, known by the geeky people as hermeneutics. Some of the lessons we learned in that process, and we specifically discussed the parable of the talents, which, as a side note, I always thought was fascinating. In that passage, the word that gets translated as talent is referring to an ancient bag of money. You could just say a bag of gold. But because of that, the way that parable embedded itself into culture, like burying your talent, that word was basically has come to mean what we understand it today in terms of skill or abilities. And it's directly tied to this parable that Jesus taught. I think that's fascinating. And so tell me, Trent, how influential do you believe the Bible is, and how has it shaped history, and how do you see its impact today?
Well, Joel, I mean, the Bible is it's the all-time bestseller, man. I mean, I think it's just slightly ahead of Don Quixote, you know? It's, yeah. A Da Vinci Code, it's slightly ahead of that, I think, but it's the all-time bestseller. It's an enduring.
And then third is 50 Shades of Grey.
Boom, exactly. So what can I say? It's an enduring book. I mean, starting, who knows exactly when the first words of the Old Testament were written, but certainly it's been around for several thousand years. It's one of the enduring books. And I'd say that how influential it is, the Bible itself is both a lead character and a foil in history. And like foil, I mean in a literary sense, meaning it provides like a contrast. And so we've talked about this before, but it's just very difficult to write music, to make movies, to make TV shows, to make art, or even have deep philosophical discussions without explicit or implicit reference to biblical phrases, biblical concepts, and biblical stories. We are so immersed in some ways with the world of the Bible. So, I mean, a lot of the ways that we seek to sort of break free, if you will, from certain parts of Scripture, just shows that we're always in conversation with it, and that applies to believers and infidels.
Yeah.
If you are,
which are you?
An infidel, yeah. If you are in Western culture, you're more or less in conversation with biblical concepts, for better or worse. And Joel, this is another lead balloony take that I would say is that I also think, on the one hand, it's extraordinarily influential and has been sort of the foundation of our civilization in many, many ways. But I'd also say that it's at the same time not influential at all. And the reason I say that is there is so much undiscovered country, as it were, in Scripture, places where people haven't even gone, haven't even considered, that so much of the biblical text has no impact whatsoever, aside from academic circles or people like you and me who really get into this stuff It has no impact on society. So it's amazing, like certain parts of the Bible or certain parts of Christianity are very influential in our society, but large swaths of the Bible have either never emerged as influential or have been forgotten, and have no purchase in society any at all. It's just amazing. I mean, do you think there's something to that? Would you agree with that?
100%. It, as you know, when I was a pastor, it was so frustrating for me to have conversations, to preach sermons where I would just like do things lightly. I would tiptoe around because, you can't just beat people over the head. I would try and invite people into uncomfortable truths. But all these people who claim to love the Bible and worship God had such violent reactions to ideas that the Bible is very clear and explicit about, but they had such very violent reactions against it. Like, there's a part of me that I would love, I think would be the best to like somehow win the trust of Donald Trump, and then like cloak ideas from the Bible to him and just let him call them all stupid loser kinds of beliefs, and just reveal that this guy that most America, most conservative Christian Americans worship, rejects this book. And I think you're right. There is he can hold it up right side up, upside down, whatever. He can hold it up, but he doesn't know what's in it. And even if he did, he wouldn't like it. So
Yeah.
So the passage that we're going to be diving into today is the book of Genesis, and it's a story that spans 13 chapters. Now, it's the story of Joseph. And before we get there, let's pause for a moment, because I think this story is what, is not only powerful, but it's found within the greater context of what we call the Old Testament. Christians call the Old Testament. Of course, my Jewish friends just call it the Bible. So tell me about the Old Testament, Trent. Are there unique perspectives or methods that you employ when interpreting the first 39 books of this 66-book modern Bible?
Well, I think principles of interpretation in general are going to apply to whatever text you're encountering, and so there's going to be some overlap in certain parts of the old, like narrative portions of the Old Testament, which is an enormous portion of the Old Testament is narrative. There's going to be overlap with narrative portions of the New Testament, but there's going to be genres like wisdom literature that's not really in the New Testament, and you're going to have to employ different methods there. We've touched on some of that before. But one thing that's unique about the Old Testament, in contrast to the New Testament, is we have quite a bit of information, like background information, historical understanding, cultural information, what was used for money, where people were living, what cultures were there, people groups. A lot of the stuff in the Old Testament, we just don't have a lot of background information for.
So you're saying we have a lot of it for the New Testament, and we don't.
Not very much for the Old Testament.
Yeah, accurate.
And also the distance, the time distance, the time gap between when these things, the texts the extant texts that we have, and when they were written down is much longer than the New Testament. So the idea of what might the original text have been, whereas you can get somewhat close with the New Testament, I don't know how close you can get with the Old Testament speculation, but there's just a lot of mystery and a lot of uncertainty that precludes, where we've talked about how it's very difficult to be dogmatic given what happens in translation, let's say, with the New Testament. It's even harder with the Old Testament because these things are so much more distant. So I think that even more humility is required. And so, yeah, I would just say each individual book requires its own approach, just like with the New Testament. But you're going to have more challenges as an interpreter because there are more genres in the Old Testament. And so, what are you going to do with those? You won't read Ecclesiastes in the same way that you're going to read Paul's letters. So you have to come with, and a lot of people don't come. They just look at, what does this verse say to me? What does it mean to me? Rather than, man, what was the author trying to do? What did the audience expect from the author? These kinds of things.
I think that's powerful, and it just made me think about. And I hope I'm right with these numbers. I'm having to draw back some early Old Testament survey courses. So the what is often called the intertestamental time between
Hmm.
Malachi and Matthew, uh, my understanding is about 200 years. And to be generous to the New Testament authors, all of those books were written within a time frame of about 70 years.
Hmm.
And we have this 200-year period before, and as you said, we have so much archaeological evidence for the New Testament. We do not have that as much for the Old Testament because
Hmm.
it's so long ago. We're talking thousands of years, friends. And so, I mean, if you just imagine 200 years ago from now, you're talking about trying to dig up these letters from people who lived in the early, colony of America, right? And even then, we have to like employ interpretation, go like, what's being said
Mm.
there? And all the more when we're talking about the Old Testament. And I like that you bring up genres because that's what I lean into. One time I
Mm.
preached a message trying to illustrate to all these people who haven't sat through all the courses that we did. Something like this is the difficulty of reading the Bible, friends. You open up this book and it's one book to you. You just see these very thin pages. Some of them have gold on the outline for whatever reason, and you think this is something that you can just read. Stop it. It is. There's a doctrine called the perspicuity of Scripture that all of it should be plain to people, and I think that is utter asinine bullshit. The Bible is not plain. The more I studied it, the more confused I was. And so I went to my local library and picked out a bunch of books and picked out stuff in my house to illustrate to people. And I said, like, the Bible has poetry, the Psalms, Song of Songs. There's parts of prophecy that are very poetic. So I had a book of Emily Dickinson and John Keats,
Mm.
which most people don't know how to read modern poetry, let alone ancient poetry.
Mm. Mhm.
Wisdom
Mhm.
literature. I pulled out, that's Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Job is put into that category often. And so I pulled out a book of Aristotle and Soren Kierkegaard, these philosophers, and then a book of 12 steps, 12 step spirituality, which is like practical wisdom. And then a prophecy. That's so hard in the modern world, but like Amos, Ezekiel, parts of the Gospels, like Zechariah prophesying at the temple, at Jesus's birth, or Agabus's daughters prophesy about a famine, or Agabus prophesies about a famine. There's the four daughters that are different. These are seers in Hebrew,
Mhm.
Navi.
Mhm.
And so what I did is I pulled out a CD that I got at the library of, I think it was Kendrick Lamar and Mos Def. These are rappers that I think are seers. They look into the culture of the day and they speak things that are not popular. Most prophets got killed, right?
Mhm.
That's what we forget. I looked at Gospels. The Gospels are kind of like history with an agenda, so to speak. Like these are people writing what their understanding of history is, but they have an agenda. So I pulled out all these like documentaries. Most of these modern documentaries are docutainment. They're trying to like
Mm.
they're trying to give you a slanted look at something that happened. And then you got like stuff like letters, Paul's epistles, and it was like apocalyptic literature. This is many parts of Ezekiel and in the Old Testament and all of Revelation. There is no version today. We don't have a version because it doesn't exist. And then we got into historical narrative, which is what we're getting into now. And I pulled out a book. I pulled out like an atlas, an almanac, because there's so much genealogies and maps and that kind of stuff. But I pulled out a book called Unbroken. Have you ever read that book?
No.
It's a really powerful book, but it's about a real person, but it's told in a very
Mm.
story form. So I pulled all that out and I had this like stage full of all these various genres of stuff. And I was like, and then I held up a Bible and it's like, do you appreciate now what I'm talking about? And I'm curious what your thoughts are on my illustration there. Do you think I helped maybe people who haven't taken all our classes, that we've taken all the classes that we've taken, maybe appreciate the complexity of this
Yeah,
leather
dude,
bound book,
that's yeah.
pleather bound
I
book.
think that's that's a very good illustration. I think that's really helpful. And the only thing I would add to it is that, like, yeah, it's kind of a shame that we refer to this bound thing as a the Bible. Yes, it's a book physically speaking, but it is a library. It is a collection of very, very, very different things. It's a little bit another analogy like going to a museum. A museum has sculpture, it has drawings, it has sketches, it has paintings. It might involve sound, but it's a wide variety of things. And so, yeah, when people say things like, "Well, the Bible says," it's like, well, the Bible is not a monolithic entity. You might say in the book of Genesis we read that, but when you say the Bible says, that's a theological statement, not a
Yeah.
literature statement.
Oh, that's powerful. Yeah, I
Yeah.
love the museum analogy. I think I used the analogy of a mixtape.
Yeah.
And it has just random songs on it that
Yep.
don't, the authors and the writers of those songs weren't talking to each other. Maybe they knew of each other, maybe not.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
So, for the sake of time, let's dive into this story.
Yeah.
Now, let's hear your thoughts on it. The story of Joseph, I know, is a story that matters a lot to you. I've heard you reference it many times in our friendship. And so when most people think of the book of Genesis, they think of like the creation story in Genesis 1, 2, and the fall, and 3, Cain and Abel, Noah, the Tower of Babel. But the most prominent character in Genesis by far is Joseph. He accounts for the last 26% of the entire book, and no character even comes close to taking up as much real estate as he does in his story. So let's break down his story, and for the sake of just helping our listeners categorize his story, because it's multiple chapters.
Yep.
There's Joseph's family and origin. We'll call that part 1. And we'll call Joseph's enslavement in Egypt as part 2. And Joseph's rise to authority and expression of authority in Egypt, part 3. So let's start with the first one. Trent, give us a rundown of Joseph's origins. How did his story begin?
Well, Joseph is one of 12 sons of Jacob, and he is kind of seen as Jacob's favorite son. So much so that Jacob gives him what can be interpreted as a coat of many colors or a long robe, some kind of special robe that designates him as a favored son, which doesn't go big with the rest of his brothers. And we learn, I think, right there in chapter 37, right out of the gate, that young Joseph is not too diplomatic and savvy. He says things more quickly than he should, if ever say them, about dreams of him ruling over his brothers and his father and mother. So he's a youngster. He's like 17 years old. He's not wise. He's the favorite son. He's got brothers he doesn't really get along with. And his dad sends him one day. His brothers are out pasturing the flocks in some other town, some other village, and some other area, and he goes and he is supposed to meet up with them, and things don't go well for. I don't know how much you want me to say into the story. Basically, he gets his brothers decide they're tired of his bullshit. They're tired of his pretensions of glory and ruling over them, and so they wanted initially to kill him, and I think it was Reuben, one of the brothers, is like, "Hey, let's not do that. That's not going to be. That's
He's the one
not
with the
right
conscience.
move."
Yeah,
He actually has a conscience, and the rest are like, "Oh yeah, okay, well, we won't kill him." They decide to sell him into slavery, and they take I think they take his tunic and they kill a goat, I believe, or a ram, and they spread the blood all over to make it look like he's been killed. And so Joseph gets taken into slavery by a Midianite caravan, I believe it is, and eventually ends up in Egypt. And meanwhile, the brothers go back to their father Jacob, and they say, "Our brother has been slain," and they present the coat to Jacob. That's kind of more or less the first act, as it were, his origin story.
and this goes back to a little bit about Jacob has 2 wives. Has a favorite wife, and Joseph is the only child of this favorite wife, and all the other brothers.
That's right. Yes.
And so there's weird political drama, like Game of Thrones-esque kind of stuff going on there in this story. Is there a
Can I
Oh,
add?
go ahead. Yeah,
Can I
add.
just add another thing? I think it's important is we'll see this as a motif running through these actual 37, 50, 14 chapters, but um, you'll see as a motif the motif of dreams. Joseph has a dream that his brothers are bowing down before him, and that the sun and the moon bow down, which is a reference to his father and mother, and that he'll have dreams. He'll meet people when he's in jail that have dreams. He'll interpret those dreams. He'll meet Pharaoh, who has dreams, interpret those dreams. So this dream motif is very, very important in this story, whatever we
Yeah,
make of it.
I love that. And I think friends out there listening, while Trent and I both share expertise in the area of biblical interpretation, I would say this, even though I've read a lot and I have a minor in writing, that's how Trent and I met. We were taking classes together. Advanced Grammar and Usage, I think, was our first class together. Trent has expertise specifically in literature, so he's bringing out things to when you read these kinds of stories. It's important. A lot of people, they think, oh, the Bible, and they tend to put it in a standalone category of like sacred scripture, which is not wrong, but it's not helpful in terms of interpretation. The truth is, that's not how Jews read it. And guess what? Jews wrote the Bible. So Christians need to get over themselves and be willing to read these scriptures without 17 layers of gold glitter all over it. These are stories, and they're written with literature sorts of tactics. So Trent, could you just speak to that a little bit for us?
Yeah, well, so one of the things that I started doing sort of in the latter portion of my seminary career was to ask questions that maybe I've been afraid to ask of the text before, that maybe other Christians were asking, but I wasn't. And one of them was like, what is the author expecting his audience to believe or think about what's being written? Are there multiple layers here? Like this story, I think you'd agree with this. This story at one level is kind of simplistic. Like the behavior of these characters is almost kind of naive. Like, for instance, something I read, Joseph in like 37 verse 10 and 11, like he reveals to his father that he's had these dreams of even his father and mother are going to bow down. And now Jacob's like, hey, wait a minute. Like he's kind of worried about it. And it says
Say that
his
again.
brothers were. What's that?
That's Jacob's like, say that again.
Say again? Yeah. And it says his brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the saying in mind. And then right after that, Jacob sends Joseph out to his brothers. And I'm thinking, are we really to believe? Does the author, is he writing at a third grade level? Or is he writing at a third grade level and also, but expecting us to ask questions like, is Jacob really so naive that he would send Joseph out knowing who his sons are, knowing what Joseph has revealed? Surely you would know your children and know you're sending Joseph out. Like, is he really that innocent? When the coat is brought back and his sons tell him what's happened to Joseph, are we really to believe at an adult level, not reading this in Sunday school, but at an adult level, are we really to believe that Jacob just took their word? Oh yeah, here's his garment. Didn't investigate. He's like, oh, my son is dead. I think this is where there's sort of that some of the terseness, some of this the minimalism, that we find in Old Testament narrative, I think invites us into the story to start asking more of the text. An analogy to this, Joel, is like the Gospel of John in the New Testament is not like my favorite gospel. I think Luke is, but John, because it's written, a lot of people say that whoever wrote John kind of had an elementary understanding of Greek, but maybe because of that, it's written with a lot of minimalism, but there's also a lot of space in the text, I think, to have sort of this multi-sensory experience and to take it in certain directions that are creative or imaginative. And I
Mhm.
think that's happening here. I'm not of the impression that whoever wrote Genesis was a children's book writer,
Yeah.
didn't have a grasp of human motivations. And so I think that we are invited to come into the text. I think Jewish interpreters for a very long time have felt that invitation to come into the text and have conversations with it. So I would just simply say that that's one thing I would say about it.
Yeah, they're reading between the lines, rabbinical
Yes, that's
traditions
right.
reading between the lines.
Yes.
Yeah. You had mentioned to me like a analogy with cartoons. What was that about?
Right. Okay. Yes. So the one analogy is that when you watch a cartoon as a child, you get a certain thing out of it and it works for you. And then you watch a cartoon as an adult, that same cartoon, and you get different things out of it. It's possible for both a movie as well as literature, in this case the book of Genesis, to fire on all cylinders, to reach different audiences. And again, that's the thing, is like, we don't know who was reading this, in what setting, in what context. And it very well could be, this is just speculative, but it's fun,
Yeah.
that this book was being read and the author was saying, there's going to be a great congregation, because I don't imagine in these settings that we had this clean, neat division of adults and children. That going to be a big groups of people, and they're going to be hearing these things, and it'll work at certain levels for the children, and it'll work at other levels for the adults. I think it's very possible that that could have been the case.
Yeah. Absolutely. And and one I always bring back to my rabbi friend who says this line that Jews aren't concerned with history, we're concerned with memory. And there is a kind of a story device for this entire story that plants the origin of the 12 tribes of Israel. And so it is why the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, right? And then Joseph is the one that flowered out, and all these sons flowered out into the nation of Israel, so to speak. And so there is kind of almost a political bent to the story. It kind of gives the origin. It's an origin story, of so to speak. So, okay, you touched on Joseph getting enslaved. He was, deceptively sold by his brothers, presented to their dad that he was dead. And now we follow Joseph, who's being brought into enslavement into Egypt. So share with us about this middle section of his enslavement.
Well, I want to stick right with what you said about memory here, because it's going to be really important to remember that the story, these are kind of somewhat artificial distinctions. The story continues on in Exodus, and in Exodus 1, we find that people are in slavery in Egypt many, many years after Joseph had died. So what we're getting here is an origin story about how the Israelites came to be enslaved in Egypt, and that's very, very important. So, yeah, Joseph finds himself in Potiphar's house, who's like the captain of the guard in Pharaoh's empire, and Joseph kind of rises like cream to the top. And this is again another motif. The refrain there is, the Lord was with him. That's said over and over again. The Lord is with him. So anyway, he rises to the top in Potiphar's household. He just finds a way of sort of attaining leadership roles and handling his business and growing wiser. And what happens? He's basically put in charge of everything in Potiphar's household. But then there's this false allegation. Like, Joseph is this hot dude, right?
He's a
stud. And Potiphar's is a stud, and Potiphar's wife is after him, and she's relentless. And finally, one day, he runs out of the house, and like she grabs a part of his clothing and holds it there, and basically accuses him of trying to take advantage of her. And the result of that is he ends up getting in prison. Well, while he's in prison there, he meets the chief cupbearer and the chief baker of is it Pharaoh's household? Like, if Pharaoh's household.
It's of his household, his court, whatever. Yeah,
that's right. And so, they have dreams, and so Joseph interprets both of their dreams, and one of the interpretations is positive and the other's negative, but it comes to pass. And anyway, long story short is Pharaoh eventually hears that there's this guy, because Pharaoh starts having dreams of famine, dreams of years of plenty, dreams of years of famine. He doesn't know that's what they are, but he's trying to figure out these dreams, and that he finds out that there's a man named Joseph who can interpret these things. And so Joseph comes and stands before Pharaoh and interprets the dreams, and Pharaoh realizes that he's dead on. And as a result, then big shocker is that Joseph rises to the top in Pharaoh's household and basically ends up as kind of like second in command in Egypt. And so we have Joseph second in command, basically has gone through these series of ups and downs, trials and tribulations. He is he's sold into slavery by his brothers, but he rises up. He's then finds himself in prison, and then he rises up again, and he's just this wonderful sort of Hollywood story of rags to riches and riches to rags and these kinds of things. So it's very dramatic and very interesting.
Yeah, I remember the story of Joseph and Potiphar, right? And Potiphar's wife. And what I remember from that story is it being constantly heralded as, especially for teenage boys as a youth group, just like, hey, I kissed dating goodbye, passion for purity, these kinds of stories about running from lust. And I'm just curious,
run from it.
Why do you think evangelicals just zero in on shit like that? I mean, it's just kind of the Genesis is full of debauchery, just full of it. There's these heroes of the faith who are like, I don't know, one has sex with his daughter who dressed like a prostitute, right? That Tamar. So it's just like the Bible's full of all these stories, but we're like, don't think about those. But look at what Joseph did.
I know, man. I don't know. I mean, I haven't thought about it a ton. I don't know how to make sense of it. I mean, I think that a lot of times you have people glomming on to sort of personal virtue as it relates to sexual purity, and then completely not caring about economic exploitation. And as we'll come to see in the story, I mean, Joseph, like every other character in the Old Testament, is a mixed bag. On the one hand, he has this personal code of honor. I won't do this. I won't offend against against Potiphar. How could I do that thing? But then he colludes with Pharaoh to masterfully create a system of economic exploitation of people during the years of plenty, so that they can exploit people in the years of famine. That is a dreadful, dreadful thing. A lot of people don't think about it. Now, there's not a lot of editorializing in the Old Testament. We don't necessarily get and the narrator or the editor or whatever saying, this is how you should feel about these characters. This is what you should think about their behavior. They just
this is the good guy. This is the bad guy. He's not doing a good thing right here, by the way. They don't say that.
Yeah, they don't. You have to come to your own conclusions. You're invited to use your own head with this stuff. And so it's just there. It's just the narrative. Here's what we have. But it is interesting. You don't get a lot of people talking about Joseph the Great colluder with foreign empire, by the way. This is a Jew acting in a sense in the long run in a way that ended up in the Joseph is a villain ever as much as he is a hero. He was the main instrument of Jewish slavery. So of getting them to that place.
Yep. It's the kind of the unintended consequences. But I find that so fascinating that growing up, the churches that I attended picked certain parts and emphasized certain parts of the Bible and completely just swept away other parts. It's kind of like the story of Noah. Look how faithful he is. Don't look at this God you love slaughtering the rest of humanity. Don't look at that. Don't look at what's happening over there. Pay attention to Noah. And so it's like, it's very interesting to me with the story of Joseph, how we do that as well. All right, so we get into this place of where he's rising to authority, the third part of the story. Give us a rundown of Joseph's authority in Egypt. What happened once he kind of got into that space of trusted authority next to the Pharaoh?
Okay, so I mean, this is kind of where we get into like the nitty gritty of his story with his brothers. I mean, we can say more about sort of what he did with the exacting a fifth of the produce so that they could store up. They had basically Pharaoh's dream was seven. Joseph interpreted Pharaoh's dream. We could say more about it as 7 years. There's going to be 7 years of plenty, abundance, and then 7 years of famine. And so they basically decide that they're going to exact a fifth of the produce from the people in the land and put that into their storehouses. And then when the time of famine comes, they'll be able to distribute that through. They don't end up not distributing it; they end up selling it, which is a crazy, crazy thing because the people they were forced to give that away and then didn't get it back. It was theirs, and they didn't get it back. But basically what happens is Joseph's brothers in the family are starting to experience the hardship, and so they go to, correct me if I get any of this story wrong, Joel, but they go to Egypt to go buy grain.
They were sent. They were sent by their dad, their father.
Dad, Jacob sent them off
because of the famines, right?
Yep.
Like we've heard, Egypt they have storehouse of plenty of resources, so we need to go and purchase some of these from them because our options are gone.
So they go to Egypt, and there they encounter Joseph, and Joseph recognizes them, but he disguises himself so they don't recognize him because obviously. They would never have guessed that he would be in this position.
Yeah.
Thought he was dead. And so there he meets his brothers, and he basically sends them. I think he like imprisons them shortly, and then like accuses them of being, you guys are spies. You're spies. You've been sent to check out the land. They're like, we're not spies. And so anyway, he like sends them away, but he holds, I think, Simeon as kind of like a hostage, right?
Benjamin,
he
right?
sends Simeon.
Oh, first Simeon.
Yeah.
Got it. Yeah.
Simeon. So, because I don't think Benjamin would come the first time.
Oh,
so anyway,
that's
Simeon,
right. You're right.
Yeah. Sends them all back. Holds Simeon, and they go back, and they're like, "Listen, this is the scenario we got. Simeon's stuck, and blah 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 blah." But when they left, Joseph had said, if you come back, you need to come back with. They had mentioned Benjamin. They'd mentioned him, and he's like, and that really broke his heart, right? Because that's his full brother.
Yep.
And so he said, you need to bring back Benjamin. And then so when the brothers go back to Jacob and they tell him everything, Jacob's like, I'm not sending Benjamin, my last son, my beloved son. I'm not doing that. My gray hair will go down to the grave in sorrow. I won't do that. So eventually, finally, they decide. Jacob's like, okay, you're going. And so they all go. And basically they go back, and Joseph receives them into his household, and they have this big feast, and they have this big feast, and again Joseph kind of messes with them and says he's going to like take them captive again. I'm butchering some of the details here, Joel, but basically he has the opportunity with his brothers for them to. He hasn't revealed himself yet, and basically, I think Joseph says, "I'm going to take and I'm going to keep Benjamin," and Judah, who basically had spearheaded the effort to have Joseph killed and then sold into slavery, and he has his own character arc in this story, and we see him finally sort of growing up and recognizing his role in the family. He finally comes to Joseph and he says, look, I can't have you take Benjamin. It's going to kill my father. What I'm asking you to do is, if you need to keep one of us here, then I'm asking that you would take me, my life or his, that you would take me and keep me and send back Benjamin. And anyway, through all this, finally, Joseph just can't take it anymore. He finally reveals himself to his brothers. He's weeping. He's embracing them. And he basically says, hey, forget about what you guys did. What you did for evil, God meant for good. This is where I ended up. And then he invites all of his family, Jacob and the whole patriarchal clan, everything, to come and live in Goshen in the land of Egypt. What have I missed there? It's such a big story. It's hard to rehash everything without forgetting some things. But
you did a great job. I feel like the ending is what I remember from these stories, the Sunday school version of story, which continued to be told to adults. It was that it's a story of Joseph's faithfulness. He was faithful. He did nothing wrong. No one ever mentioned the nuances or the wrinkles of the story to me growing up. They never mentioned that maybe Joseph was being a spoiled brat. They never mentioned that the brothers might have had good reason to be jealous because of the
Mhm.
father's clear favoritism. I never heard stories about how Joseph colluded with a political power
Mhm.
to create oppression. But that scene at the end is so powerful when they come together. And so
Mm.
we'll get to that in a minute, but I want to touch on a few themes that you've talked about. One being dreams or visions. So
Mm.
Joseph has these dreams and visions as a child, as a young adult, and he tells them to people. And in some sense, the story arc is these visions that it was younger come true because his whole family come and bow down to him, so to speak, as this ruler of Egypt. Now, Joseph's ability to interpret dreams is a theme, and both of us grew up Pentecostal charismatic, where dreams and visions were regularly talked about. So, just a quick question to you: have you ever experienced anything like this? And how do you interpret some of this? Is this real or is this fantasy?
Man, I mean, really quickly, I want to just my instant reaction is no, it's just a joke. It's fake. I didn't have. I was one of those persons that was really frustrated at being in a Pentecostal charismatic tradition in high school and then in college at Oral Roberts University because was constantly hearing about people saying they'd heard from God, God had revealed himself, he'd spoken to them. These are the words that they had heard. And I really badly wanted to have that experience, and I really never did. And so I was very frustrated by that. That was a major source of irritation. But I will say that I don't, I can't discount this thing entirely. I think it's mysterious. I think there are some
Mm.
people who seem to get a lot from their dreams. I've read stories of people in the Amazon, particularly the Piraha, who the entire tribe claimed to see a person or a spirit or some kind of being that's totally invisible to the missionary who is there completely, but everybody sees it. I don't know what to make of that. I really don't. Now it's not scientifically falsifiable, so I don't really know if I can be dogmatic about it one way or the other. And when it comes to, well, I won't say much, but when it comes to the story, I also don't know what to make of it because the dreams that he interprets the dreams and then these things happen.
Uh-huh.
But the other question that I think comes up is what are we to make of dreams? What are the function of dreams in these people's lives? It happens all throughout. I think Jacob has dreams where things are revealed to him, Abraham, Isaac as well. Through the rest of Scripture, dreams are in the book of Daniel. The rulers have dreams, and Daniel comes to interpret. So this is very, very important. But I think there's more to it than just here, let me tell you the future. It does reveal something. One of the things that Walter Brueggemann talks about, that Old Testament scholar, when he talks about Pharaoh has dreams that are related to anxiety and scarcity. Now, does he have those dreams because God just wants to reveal something to him, or do we see those dreams are a reflection of who he is? Like Joseph has dreams. This is something that I read when I was doing some research on this. Is that Joseph has Jacob and Abraham and Isaac have dreams about God's blessing to the nations through them and about posterity. Joseph has dreams about his own personal greatness. What does that say about Joseph? Pharaoh
Mm.
has dreams about um,
Scarcity.
scarcity and
Yeah.
accumulation and anxiety. What does that say about him as a person? So this is they work at different levels in the story, I'd say.
I love that. And I will also add that I think this is one of the reasons why you and I align so much because I had a very similar experience growing up Pentecostal charismatic. I believed, I believed, I believed. I wanted to believe and I believed. And yet I still felt like I didn't
Yeah.
have as much faith as the other people around me who were claiming these things that I was just like looking around going, wait, what? How are you seeing angel feathers and gold dust? I don't, what? What's wrong with me?
Yes,
And
yes,
now
right.
I just look back on it honestly and just I know the power of the mind to delude ourselves. It is extraordinarily powerful. And to me, the story of me not having enough faith doesn't align with my own experience of my own life. I can't. That is not something I'm willing to accept. What I am willing to accept is what you're talking about. Is there's mystery. There's things that I don't
Hmm.
understand. There are some things, some instances that people talk about that are more credible than other instances that other people talk about. As a pastor, I heard some very crazy things from people telling me that they heard from God that were clearly just egoic fear, insecurity, trying to manipulate, and the problem with this spiritualization of dreams and visions is that you can't argue with the God inside of someone's head.
Hmm.
Like
Hmm.
you said, it's unfalsifiable. You can't argue with it. And so it props up extraordinarily egoic and narcissistic people to be in places of power, which is why I think the Pentecostal charismatic tradition tends to have the most cult-like leaders in it because there's the least amount of accountability built into that system. You can't argue with the God inside of someone's head. And someone who is strongly egoic in their personification tends to attract people who are extraordinarily insecure who will believe whatever they say, the man of God, so to speak. And that's been my kind of observation about the tradition you and I grew up in.
And
And
if
it's a
I
bit
can
of a
say,
Debbie
add this.
Downer, sorry.
Yeah, no. I think another wrinkle to this would be that I'm thinking just now about the contrast between like Daniel, who was the guy who quote unquote spoke truth to power, and he ended up in the lion's den. Think about, was it then later on in his life? So initially, I think he was prophesying to Nebuchadnezzar,
Yep.
and then later on, it was, I think, maybe Belteshazzar. I might be getting the names wrong, but later on, there's this big banquet and the story of the writing on the wall.
Yep.
And basically, you have Daniel who gives the interpretation of dreams to Belteshazzar, and it's not a pleasant revelation. Um, Maybe Joseph is just kind of assumed, like Pharaoh just assumes that he gives him the right interpretation, but
I know.
Joseph could have interpreted that in a different way, in a judgmental way. But he gives this interpretation, and he's like, now that we know, now that I've interpreted this dream for you, let's carry out a program that will take advantage of this. And it played right into, it's almost like he knew exactly what Pharaoh's psychology was, and he just went right in there and said, I'm going to move things along in a way that will be
Yeah.
quite salutary for you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. You love
So
power, Pharaoh. I'm going to show up as your
that's right.
powerful tool. And I'm
That's
happy to
exactly
play that
right.
role for you to get me out of prison.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. I
Who
mean, the
wouldn't want to do
truth is
that,
on
right?
display.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's unbelievable. It's such a mixed, multi-layered story, man. And we could go on and on about it. Yeah. So.
Okay, so I wanna touch on a couple of things real quick. Forgiveness. That's another topic that this book or this story talks about a lot with the brothers. Tell me about your view on that.
Okay. Well. All right. So, you know, I I I think I love the bald humanity of this story and all the different layers as we've already talked about. But and I don't, as far as forgiveness, I don't know if that word actually is mentioned in the story. The concept is there. I'm just going to say that forgiveness is kind of a word that I don't really use myself, and it's a concept that I reject. What I prefer is I see the healing power of time. I see the growth of character in this story in Judah and Joseph, and I see the reinstatement and repair of siblings. It's an incredibly moving moment in the Bible. I think that when I think about forgiveness, I think about like it in a monetary way. People talk about debt forgiveness. I mean, that's a big topic. Or student loan forgiveness, is you owe a debt, and we're going to tell you that you don't owe that thing anymore. And I just don't see like sin against people or harming people in the sense of like a debt that's accrued. Um, That's one way to see it. I just don't prefer that language. I think sometimes it deprives us of the opportunity for, when and I've talked about this, reparative restorative justice. People are like, "Oh, when are you going to forgive me?" Or people have said to me, "When are you going to forgive this person?" It's like, well, why don't we talk more about the process of healing and repair, and what role this person might have in our lives, or my life, or your life in the future? Forgiveness is just kind of willy-nilly, and in my mind, kind of letting people off the hook. I know that's not the only thing to say about forgiveness. I just wish we had a different word, because the way that I hear it, the way that I feel that word and think about that word, oftentimes is tainted by advice that you hear in popular culture. But you just need to forgive that person. You need to
Yeah.
forgive and forget, and all this kind of thing, and irrespective of whether or not the person has made amends or atoned for their crimes or whatever it is.
Yeah. I appreciate that perspective as well. I see things a little bit differently, but I think you and I would likely get to the same place if we talked about it. Maybe that's a podcast for another time. What I love is one time you told me about the story, how you've read it, and every time you read it, it moves you.
Deeply.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's Joel. It's the only story. I won't say it's probably the main story in the Bible that every time I read it, I just feel deeply moved. I think of Joseph. Granted, there's a lot that we can say, but went through tremendous betrayal and tremendous loneliness, and being exiled to a foreign land. And he's got these brothers who maybe they had a right to be peeved, but they did horrible things to him. And then through time and through chance and all these kinds of things, they come together again. And you see not this cheap forgiveness, but a real forgiveness of, you've come and you've acknowledged that
Reconciliation.
you've done. Yeah, it's reconciliation. It's
Yeah.
okay. Joseph's like, I don't want you to be bothered. He says, when you go back to your dad, because they're going back to get everybody and bring him back, he says, I don't want any arguing on the way. That's not what I want. I just love that. Is I don't want this to be our story. I want there to be a new story. And I love that. I love that sense that we can start over again. We can genuinely forget about it because you've come to me and you've acknowledged what you've done. Then let's go forward. It's just I think it's wonderfully powerful.
It's
it's
atonement without
so
anyone
great.
getting crucified.
Yes. Yes, that's right. Yes, it's my favorite thing. That's right. Nobody dies on a tree for people to be okay with each other again. It's fucking great. Yeah.
See, Calvin's God is a dick for that.
CF.
A deeper understanding of our views on that. All right, Trent,
Yeah.
Final question.
Yeah.
Many ways we've been leaning into traditional interpretations of this passage. However, this podcast is not called Floating Balloons. It is called Lead Balloons. So take us out with an unpopular opinion. Are there any unflattering interpretations of this passage that you would leave us with?
Right. Well, peppered throughout the story is sort of the wily, shrewd behavior of Pharaoh and Joseph, and the way they take advantage of the famine in the land. They use. So we talk about dreams, but they use the power. We might also think of it as divination, seeing the future, having access to things that most people don't. They use the power of divination to enrich Egypt and themselves. Imagine having the sports almanac like in Back to the Future 2, and you can tell the future, and so you know what to do. They have the best intelligence. They have their own CIA, and they use that power to enrich Egypt, but more to enrich themselves. Those at the top, the things trickle up. And so they have like this double tithe, like 10 times 2. They have a 20% extraction that they force upon the people. Okay, all right. You could just come out to people and say, listen, we got good intel. There's going to be 7 years of plenty and 7 of famine. So here's what you need to do. You guys are going to have largesse, and so you're going to give that over to us. We're going to put it in the granaries that we have. And the years of famine come, you're going to get it. You're going to get it all back, and then some. And that's not what happens at all. They extract this by force of law. And then when the famine comes, they fucking require people to pay money, which they don't have because of the famine, to get the stuff that was theirs to begin with. And man, this stuff is it's like Walter Brueggemann says, it seems like it's written today, right? I mean, this is so relevant. This is like a really small example, but one analogy would be like our tax money that we don't really have a say in, like, do not much of a say in where, whether or not we want to be taxed, but our taxes are taken from us. We might call that like forced investment. And they go to, one of the things they go to is like government research, like military research and stuff.
Uh-huh.
One of the things I learned that's fascinating is the iPhone, its key technologies came from military research and military technologies. Well, you and I, the American taxpayer, paid
I
for all
invested
that.
in that. Yeah.
Should we not be getting fucking free iPhones? No. You got to pay out the wazoo hundreds upon hundreds of dollars for stuff that we paid for. And that's just one small example. But it's a terrible, a dark story about two people who had access to information about what was going to happen, and then they found a clever way by use of force to extract from people and then create this ever deepening spiral of poverty and domination and accumulation for themselves. It's a really, really dark story, and it's just, when people think about the story of Joseph, that's not even the 10th thing on the list that they think about.
Nope. And it's so interesting that, like, you think this son of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Joseph, the son of Jacob. I'm sorry, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the son of Jacob. He would be the one that would be like the savior. No, he's the one that collected everyone to become a ready pool of slaves for hundreds of years, and It would be Moses who then is raised up to lead everyone out. So Joseph is seen as this super faithful character who is actually the hinge pin on centuries of suffering.
Yeah. Jeez, incredible.
Man, this has been so much fun, Trent.
Yeah, it's been great, man. Really, really fun.
What were you about to say there?
Just again, and it's as I come back to it, it's like the fucking Bible won't leave me alone, because as much as we say that, as much as in my mind now I'm prepared to sort of throw Joseph into a category, I'm also reminded about these other storylines within these chapters 37 through 50 of Genesis of how he brought about a family reconciliation. And maybe it's, again, it's just to leave us in constant tension as we leave this story.
That's what I love about critical thinking, is it doesn't let me land in any safe, tidy little category. I never get to land there. And it's uncomfortable, which is why I think a lot of people refuse to employ critical thinking skills.
Yeah.
But what it does do is it allows me to see the endless possibilities and the gray in between the black and white. And that's really at the heart of why we started this podcast.
Yeah.
So thank you, friends, for joining us for yet another episode of Lead Balloons, the alchemy of unpopular opinions. Trent, any final words?
No, thanks for tuning in, and we are excited to do more like these. And please reach out to us at our email, leadballoonspodcast@gmail.com. Like and subscribe on our YouTube channel, which is Lead Balloons Podcast, and go to our website at leadballoonspod.com, where you'll find episodes and blog posts and general information about us.
Thanks, friends.